I want to say that my story is really different from a lot of other stories because I was never in a camp. I was very fortunate. We say that there were four kinds of people during the Holocaust. There were the victims, the perpetrators, the bystanders, which were the most numerous, and the upstanders. And really the reason that I'm here is because of the upstanders, that is people who were not Jewish, but who helped us and all along the way. And so that's what my story is really about. And I still remember as a small child of maybe 4, we lived right across the street from the German headquarters. And I remember seeing the sentries walking back and forth. My mother and my grandparents had to wear the yellow star, which I'm sure you know about, but I didn't because I was under 6. But my father was demobilized in the so-called unoccupied zone, which was much freer, actually, And of course, my mother wasn't allowed to travel. So they knew we were Jewish in that little town. My mother wanted to rejoin my father, but she couldn't travel because she was Jewish. This is where my first upstander comes in. His name was Monsieur Fournier. He was a friend of ours, a neighbor. He was a hunter, and this was in a very busy, very mountainous part and was in the Alps near Switzerland, and that'll come in a little later. One morning, my mother woke up very early, and Monsieur Fournier, who, as I said, was a hunter and knew all these back roads and everything, he walked with my mother. They walked all day. My mother told me later that her feet were swollen for 2 weeks. They walked all day. Monsieur Fournier leading the way, and guiding her. And she was very lucky because they didn't stop them. And they walked and they came to a small town, and my mother stayed there overnight. She went to a hotel of some sort and she slept there. And then in the morning, she took the train and she rejoined my father. In the meantime, I stayed with my parents, my grandparents. I was about 5 by that time. It was 1942. And my mother wanted us to, and my father wanted me to rejoin them. And I was living with my paternal grandparents at the time. And they didn't want me to go because they said, nobody's going to hurt us. We have plenty of food. You don't know what it's like over there. Leave her with us. But my mother, remember, during the First World War, she had been sent to live with her grandparents for 4 years. And when she came home, she didn't like it because her mother was really, really strict. And her grandparents, were her grandparents. They were not as strict. And, and all she remembered were grandparents. So she felt like she was put in, and she didn't want that to happen to me. And so she said, no. Jacqueline, because that's my name, she said, no, Jacqueline has to come with us. And so Monsieur Fournier again, he pretended I was his daughter. And if I was stopped and asked any question, I had to say I was Josiane Fournier, not Jacqueline Ash. Again, very fortunate. And we went on the train and nobody asked me any questions. And then my Monsieur Fournier and my mother met a prearranged stop, and she took me back on the train to where my father now was. I said before that my grandparents lived near Switzerland. Switzerland was neutral. And Monsieur Fournier told my grandparents that it would have taken my grandparents to Switzerland, and for whatever reason, they refused work. And my father, and this is another upstander that I'm going to talk about, my father had been able to get a job in a rayon factory. And the manager knew that my father was Jewish and knew he wasn't supposed to give him a job, but he did give him a job. And so that's another upstander. And so my father had a job during the war. Anyways, unfortunately, my grandparents were not so lucky. They had refused to go to Switzerland. And for this, I need my card because I don't remember all these numbers. So I'm going to give you a few numbers. They were arrested by the French police on February 24th, 1944. They couldn't, I'm sure they couldn't believe it because they hadn't done nothing bad. They didn't realize, I guess, that it was just because they were born Jewish, you know, that it had nothing to do with anything that they had done or not done. It was racially based, actually. Anyways, they were arrested on February 24th, 1944. They were taken to Auschwitz. They were on that railroad car that for 3 days. They arrived on March 10th, 1944, and they were immediately murdered. So if I had stayed with them as they wanted me to, I would not be here. The other thing my father did was he joined the French resistance. Now, he had a difficult time doing that because, of course, they wouldn't, you know, he was new in that area because he had just been demobilized there in 40, and this was like 42, 41, 42. And of course, in the resistance, you know, they had to be very secretive because they didn't know who among their neighbors, you know, might turn them in. He was finally able to join the resistance in 1943. And at first what they did was sabotage. You know, they would put, and I think you're old enough to understand this, they would put bombs on the railroad tracks to stop the trains, you know, from going back to Germany. They would do stuff like that. But on June 6, 1944 was D-Day. And of course, they found out through, actually, it's a poem that I have hanging outside my door, and it was a code, you know, they found out through the BBC, British Broadcasting Corporation, that sent this poem out, and that's when they knew that June the 6th had happened. So my father and his friends, his fellow resistance fighters, went up in the mountains on June 10th to fight more openly. I assume that by that time, the British and the Americans were dropping armaments down to them, rifles and things like that, because that's how they could get their arms. You know, unlike the United States, where it seems everybody has a gun, in Europe, not very many people have guns, okay? So they had to wait for munitions and things like that. A few weeks later, it was decided it was too dangerous for the families of the underground, of the resistance fighters to stay where they were. So we went up into the mountains too. And I still remember that we had to walk, and it was so steep. My sister was in a baby carriage, and they sent down one of the older gentlemen to help us get to where we were going. And he had his cane hooked around the rung, you know, of the baby carriage. And my mother was pushing, he was pulling. And that's where we were bombed. The Germans were trying to get rid of everybody, was fighting them. We had heard bombs before that were close, but they were never right on us. But then we got bombed. And I mean, when I say we bombed, first we were sitting at the table, a couple of families in the house up in the mountains, and the soup bowls went up, the table went up, the soup bowls went down, the table went down, and I still remember that nothing was, the soup bowls were not broken, but we ran out of the house. The house next door was like a big hole. So we just escaped it, you know, because these were bombs that would only take out, yeah, it had some land around it, but they weren't the bombs we have now, I mean. And so then the Germans landed, and they were mostly young guys. This was towards the end of the war. I'm sure they were draftees, you know, and, you know, there were no Gestapo around as far as I know. But anyways, they took us aside. They separated me from my mother, and they asked me where was my father. And I don't remember who told me to say this, but somebody must have told me, unless I was smart enough to think of it all my own. I said, my father works in Grenoble, which was the big city. And I don't remember any of the other questions, but I must have satisfied them, because they didn't really, you know, whatever it was, they didn't really get anything that they could use. By the way, I forgot to mention that after the bombing stopped and we had to go down back to the house, I couldn't walk because I was so scared. I was so petrified. I could not get up, you know, on my legs. I could not walk. I we went up into the mountain, and I had to slide down the hill. I still remember that. It was just a really petrified. I was really petrified. And that's about it. I'd love to take any questions or comments.
Since you were so young, did you kind of understand what was going on?
I'm sorry, say that again.
Since you were so young, like, did you understand what was going on and why everything was happening, and like what your father was
I didn't understand, you know, the ramification. I knew it was very dangerous to be Jewish, and I knew, even though I really didn't know much about what being Jewish was, because I couldn't have any Jewish education about, you know, and I knew I mustn't tell anybody. Any other questions?
Yes. Okay. After the war, once you kind of learned about what was happening, did you end up seeing any propaganda that you kind of like learned about or like thought about later on?
Any propaganda? Yeah, I have some actually. And I forgot to talk about my grandparents' letter to us, but it's a little, what they basically say in the letter, which is the letter when they got arrested. They tell us that tonight we were arrested by French police, and both of them say, don't worry about us, nothing will happen to us, you know. And one of them says, if God wills it, they will not lock us up. I don't think they had any idea what was going to happen to them, you know. What did I want to say? Well, I hope that everybody can be an upstander. You don't have to save a life to be an upstander. If you see bullying, if you see something happening that you don't think is right, that, and just remember that everybody, no matter how much difference they seem than you, we're all human beings, and we all have certain things in common if you look beyond the externals.